Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Good morning, and welcome to the 146th Landon Lecture on Public Affairs. The Landon Lectures were started in 1966 by the late Governor Alf Landon and the late K-State President James McCain. The goal of the Landon Lectures is to bring the most prominent public figures to Kansas State to discuss the pressing issues of the day. We are very pleased today to welcome Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld to the Landon podium to join 145 predecessors in bringing his thoughts and opinions on important public issues. Secretary Rumsfeld, thank you so much for coming to K-State today to give a Landon lecture. Let's give him another big hand. Before introducing members of the Platform Party, I would like to introduce some very distinguished guests in the audience. And let me start with Joyce Rumsfeld. Joyce, thank you so much. Joyce Rumsfeld. Thank you very much. Thanks, Joyce. And then a very dear friend of our family and K-State, no other than Mary Jo Myers. Mary Jo, thank you very much. And then we have a congressman here who wins by 75-25, 80-20. He's unbeatable, he's invincible. Congressman Jerry Moran. There he is right there. We're very happy to have the chairman of the Kansas Board of Regents and K-State graduate. He's from here in Manhattan, Nelson Ghaly. Nelson, thank you for coming. There he is right there. And we have another regent from Wichita, Kansas, a K-State graduate, Regent Jim Greer. And then, ladies and gentlemen, we are honored and pleased to have Lieutenant General David Petraeus, Commander of the Combined Arms Center of Fort Leavenworth. There he is. Thank you very much. Thank you. Then I would like to introduce to you the Major General, the Commander of the 1st Infantry Division of Fort Riley, Major General Carter Ham. Carter? And ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce to you some great Americans. How about these guys up here in the 1st Infantry Division? Thank you! America thanks you! In terms of the Platform Party, on my left, Mr. Roger Adams. He's the Rare Books Librarian and President of our superb Kansas State Faculty Senate. Thank you. Then, next to him, a rising star at K-State and in American politics, a senior in agricultural technology management, the president of our K-State student body, Lucas Maddie. Lucas? On my right, Edward Seaton, chairman of the Landon Patrons and editor-in-chief and publisher of the Manhattan Mercury. Next to him, a person who has done a great job in helping us bring in distinguished Americans and people throughout the world to the Landon Lecture Series, Dr. Charles Reagan, Associate to the President and Chairman of the Landon Lecture Series. Chuck Reagan. Well, ladies and gentlemen, my job here today is to introduce General Richard Myers, who will introduce the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. Well, General Myers, as you know, is an outstanding graduate of the Army ROTC program here at K-State. Air Force. Rising through the ranks to 4-star general and to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In that capacity, he served as the principal military advisor to the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council. General Myers served 2 terms as chairman of the Joint Chiefs and 1 term as vice chairman. General Myers served 2 terms as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. No, I've got that already. General Myers is a command pilot with more than 4,000 hours in a wide variety of fighters, including 600 combat hours in the F-4 Phantom. I am very pleased that General Myers now holds the title of Foundation Professor of Military History and Leadership at Kansas State. Now, isn't that a great thing for K-State? Ladies and gentlemen, a great American, a great member of the Air Force and the American military, General Myers will now introduce the Secretary of Defense. Let's hear it for General Myers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you, President Weefald. It's a real honor to be here, and it's an honor to introduce the Secretary of Defense. Most of you know the basics of his biography, naval aviator. We sometimes quibble over the difference between naval aviation and Air Force aviation. You know, he was a member of Congress, several jobs in the White House to include White House Chief of Staff, Secretary of Defense in 2 different centuries. He doesn't like it put that way, but those are the facts. Very successful businessman, Chief Executive Officer of Searles Pharmaceuticals. And those are the basics, and I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here in just a minute. But first, let me add something about Joyce Rumsfeld. Joyce has been his rock through what I consider, in my view, the most challenging years for our democracy and our way of life since the Civil War. The rock at his side has been Joyce Rumsfeld. She has a balance and a ballast that keeps her perspective pretty clear, no matter what the tides of praise or criticism might be. That's a very useful thing to have in Washington, D.C., by the way, when you have high public office. And she has a joie de vivre, and a, yes, you do, Joy, that quickly captures those around her and helps them enjoy life the way that she enjoys life. Mary Jo and I are deeply honored that you would be accompanying the Secretary here to Kansas State University today. Thank you, Joyce. I know an introduction is not supposed to be a lecture, but I've got the podium and I don't see a hook. Let me talk about 2 things about Secretary Rumsfeld that I think the pundits get very, very wrong. One is the enormous task of trying to drag the Department of Defense out of the Cold War into the 21st century. This takes enormous physical energy. It takes enormous intellectual effort. The Department of Defense, as you well understand, is a huge bureaucracy, resistant to change just by the way it's designed. But the Secretary had the energy, the perseverance, and the vision, and he had the support of the senior military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and other senior military leaders to try to change the Department of Defense. And I would say that in his tenure as Secretary of Defense, that the department has undergone more profound change in the last 6 years than in any time in its history since the National Security Act of 1947. And I think history will record that. A couple of examples. Our force posture around the world dramatically changed. That hadn't changed basically since World War II, but now that's changed. Our posture in Korea dramatically changed from what it was 6 years ago, another posture that hadn't changed for 50 years. A NATO that's been reinvigorated, which takes a lot of effort, a lot of intellectual effort, a lot of energy, which the Secretary brought to that. So I think as you sit there and you think about, are we better prepared today to meet the uncertainties of tomorrow? In my view, you can say yes. And a large part of that is the hard work, the perseverance of Secretary Rumsfeld. The second thing I'd like to talk about is the Secretary's relationship with the senior military. And here again, I think the pundits get it absolutely wrong. And I don't know why they do. But bits of information put together without context usually doesn't bring much meaning. And we've had a lot of that lately. I'll make a couple of statements here that I think are statements of fact. I have worked with several secretaries of defense. I've never worked with one that has spent more time with the senior military leadership than this Secretary of Defense. More time. In fact, he used to quip that he spent more time with me than he did with his wife, Joyce, during the waking hours. And that, I think that's absolutely another fact. The President yesterday talked about the Secretary's loyalty to him. Another thing that's not understood or talked about is the Secretary's loyalty down the chain of command, which he is squarely in. I remember as General Franks left the office to go to the Middle East to begin combat operations in Iraq. It was one of the more poignant moments. It's General Franks, it's Secretary Rumsfeld, and myself. As I recall, the only three in the office, maybe the military assistant was there as well. And the Secretary says, well, we've done all the planning. We've been planning for over a year. The President's given us his decision. Win, lose, or draw, we're all in this together, and we'll stand together as we take on this adversary. He has had many opportunities to deflect the arrows coming his way to the military. Many opportunities. He's never taken one of those opportunities. If you go back and read a little bit about Abu Ghraib and people wanting to place blame, it would have been easy for the Secretary of Defense to deflect it to a department, to individuals. He never did that. He sucked up all those arrows and continued to lead the department in the way that he knew was right. So it's my honor to introduce a very dedicated public servant, a man who has the greatest of integrity and who has, I believe, led the department from the Cold War, shook off all those old vestiges, and brought us into the 21st century. A tough man, the Secretary of Defense of the United States of America, Secretary Don Rumsfeld.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. General Dick Myers, thank you so much for those words. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for that very warm welcome. Later today, we'll be attending the dedication of a building here at Kansas State in General Myers' honor, which is a well-deserved tribute to one of this university's most distinguished alumni. Dick and Mary Jo were college sweethearts. They were married on this campus. And my wife Joyce and I go back even farther. We met in high school and have been married some 52 years. Someone asked Joyce one day, "How in the world did you stay married to that guy for 52 years?" She very quickly said, "He travels a lot." I thought she was kidding. Well, Dick Myers has traveled a good bit himself, and I'm sure Mary Jo would never say something like that. Over the years, Dick and Mary Jo have been through countless moves. They've traveled places across the globe to serve our country. But I can tell you that their hearts have always belonged to Kansas. And I think everyone here would agree that they have done Kansas proud. Indeed, they have done our nation proud. President Weefald, Mr. Reagan, Mr. Seaton, I certainly appreciate this invitation. I hope all of you appreciate how I have managed so skillfully public affairs for this event. I wanted to put the Landon Lecture on the map, so I did my best. I'm glad I could help out. It was Nancy Kassebaum, Alf Landon's daughter, who first talked to me about coming to do this lecture, and it was in Japan when her husband Howard Baker was the ambassador, and I said I'd really like to do it, and I'm glad I could be here. Mr. Adams and members of the faculty, Lucas, president of the student body. Is that what it's called? How did you do it? It was easy, huh? Well, congratulations to you. Congressman Moran, it's good to see you. I want to thank you for being here and for your service to the country. We're also very honored to have a very special veteran with us here, born in Manhattan, a hero of the Battle of Normandy, Congressional Medal of Honor recipient, Walter Ehlers. Where is Walter? General Petraeus, General Ham, thank you both for your superb service to the country, and certainly a very special greeting to the men and women here from Fort Riley, Fort Leavenworth, the Kansas State Army and Air Force ROTC cadets, volunteers all. We are deeply grateful to each of you for your service to the country and for your commitment to the defense of our nation. I would start on a personal note. My time as Secretary of Defense, I've come away truly inspired by the professionalism, the dedication, the dignity of the men and women in uniform and the folks at the Department of Defense who work every day to help keep the American people safe. When I was in Afghanistan not long ago, a young soldier told me, he said, I really can't believe we're allowed to do something this important. You know, I feel the same way. I'm so honored to have had the opportunity to be part of something so important, so vital to the future of our country and to the cause of human freedom. It has been the highest honor of my life to serve our country and to work so closely with our outstanding troops. It's a pleasure to take part in this lecture series named for a governor, a presidential candidate, and a statesman of great civility. But I guess that perhaps what he was most proud of was that he was a Kansan, and he said so frequently. It's said that the geographic center of the 48 states is here in Kansas, and that's fitting. If you think about it, this part of the world has given our nation some of the truly great leaders of the last century. Governor Landon, Along with him was General Dwight Eisenhower from Abilene, Bob Dole from Russell. Harry Truman lived next door in Missouri. One of Ronald Reagan's biographers said that he really never understood President Reagan until he went to Illinois and experienced firsthand where President Reagan had grown up. These individuals embodied the values instilled in the sons and daughters of this part of the Great Plains and Midwest. Here, folks tend to have a good perspective about things, about the difference between right and wrong. They've grown up with an appreciation for the splendor and the decency of America and of the American people. Well, we meet today at a time of peril for our nation and for the principles that it represents. In a sense, this is not new. In different ways, at different times, and from different sources, our nation and our values have been threatened since our very beginnings as a country. But today, in the first war of the 21st century, we face an enemy that in many ways is unlike any our country has ever faced in our long history. We're engaged in a new and unfamiliar war that is even today not yet well understood. It's a struggle that will require all of us, our country, our government, our military, and the American people, to think and act differently than we have in other conflicts. And I want to spend a few minutes talking about this challenge before responding to some questions. I'm told that Kansas State has a Cold War studies program that examines the history of the long twilight struggle. Well, like the Cold War, this era finds America and our allies in a struggle against an ideology of global reach. And like the Cold War, this era requires us to adapt and adjust our strategies, our way of thinking, and our institutions. 40 years ago, Governor Landon spoke about the challenge of that era and the need to face what he called the new realities of international life. When he spoke in 1966, there was most certainly no assurance that America would prevail against the Soviet Union. That year, the number of troops in Vietnam nearly doubled to more than 300,000 in an increasingly divisive conflict. No less than 7 violent coups occurred around the world that year. There was doubt and division, even among our allies, even within our own country. France pulled out of the NATO defense structure and invited NATO out of France. When I was U.S. ambassador to NATO, I had to race back to Washington to testify before a U.S. Senate committee against an amendment, a Senate amendment, that proposed to withdraw all of our forces from Western Europe. Eurocommunism, the so-called good communism, was very much in vogue. It was popular. Many of the so-called elites in our country argued that America was the problem, not the Soviet Union, that the arms race was a big misunderstanding. Millions of people demonstrated and marched, not against the Soviet Union, but against the United States and our European allies. We tend to forget that. Almost until the day of its demise, many argued that communism was the wave of the future. President Reagan used to tell the story of a young Soviet who finally saved up enough money to buy a car. And a Soviet clerk stamped the man's paper and told him he would get his car in 10 years. The young man asked, "Will it come in the morning or the afternoon?" The clerk, astonished, responded, "Well, what difference does it make?" The young man replied, "Because the plumber's coming in the morning." The great lesson of the Cold War is that totalitarianism, ruled by fear and terror, in whatever guise it takes, ultimately does not work. And when people finally realize that truth, those systems tend to collapse. Today marks the 17th anniversary of the breach of the Berlin Wall, the most visible symbol of the end of an era and of a bankrupt ideology. When thousands of Berliners climbed over that wall to reunite with friends and family, that they had been separated from for decades. They went in one direction. They went west to the free world, and they vividly understood exactly what it was that they had been fighting for all those years. There are some similarities between the Cold War and the struggle we face today, but this long war represents and presents unprecedented challenges for us, wholly unlike any that the United States has ever faced. There can be no doubt but that the murderous communist regimes imprisoned, starved, and sometimes massacred their own citizens. We know that. But they were nation states. They had capitals. They had laws. They had 5-year plans. They had diplomats to sign agreements, even if they broke them. Unlike the Cold War, our enemy has no state and no territories to defend. They murder innocent Muslim civilians by the thousands, men, women, and children alike. The enemy cannot be deterred through rational self-interest. Today's threats come less from nation states, but rather from enemies that operate in the shadows, that strike through asymmetric and irregular means. On September 11th, we saw the deadly effects of this new type of warfare. Armed with $5 box cutters, 19 hijackers killed 3,000 Americans and inflicted hundreds of billions of dollars in damage. In Iraq and Afghanistan, insurgents fashioned deadly IEDs and road bombs using propane tanks and garage door openers. Nations like Iran and Syria seek to undermine U.S. and allied interests by moving weapons and money and terrorists and insurgents. In the future, there could be attacks on computer networks, water supplies, communication systems. Our military was organized, trained, and equipped largely for conventional warfare, not asymmetric or irregular warfare. In fact, for much of the past century, the U.S. Armed Forces operated essentially as separate and sometimes even competing branches of service. In 1986, Congress passed legislation to restructure the military into a more joint force. Since then, our military has been learning to fight and learning well how to fight in a single, coordinated force. That reform of the military has been one of their most impressive achievements. But to win this global struggle against violent extremists, all elements of national power, all agencies of government, as well as a broad coalition of nations, will have to be brought to bear more effectively. To the extent possible, we can no longer afford to have Defense and State Department, CIA and Homeland Security, Treasury and Justice, Agriculture and Commerce, each waging their own campaigns with their own rules, their own restrictions, each overseen by separate congressional committees and subcommittees. Defense, diplomacy, and development do not fit neatly into separate compartments today. Success requires that security, governance, and development programs progress together. Our military cannot lose a battle in Afghanistan or Iraq, but our military cannot win all alone. They need the help of the other departments and agencies. They need the help of a broad coalition, and that is a vastly more complex task. In Afghanistan, for example, provincial reconstruction teams need to draw on resources and expertise from a range of specialties. These teams have achieved a good deal, but their success has been limited because their activities are too often thought to remain almost exclusively the responsibility of the Department of Defense. Our military cannot lose, as I say, but to win will require much more than military force alone. Governance and development, as I say, must proceed apace. Second, we need to recognize that this struggle against extremism cannot and will not be won by any single country, even the United States of America. It will be won over time by the hundreds of millions of Muslims, Iraqis, Afghans, Egyptians, Indonesians, as well as European and American Muslims who will ultimately be responsible for winning the struggle against violent extremists. The Defense Department has asked for increases in funding and authority to help to build the capacity and the capabilities of partner nations. This will be a difficult shift in approach for our country. Change is hard, and it's not easy for Americans to teach and assist while others act and do. Ours is a nation and a military with a hands-on, can-do spirit. But today's war against a global enemy requires first and foremost that we enable our friends and allies, especially those in the Muslim world, to confront and defeat the extremists within their own borders and on their own airways. The shift towards building our partners' capabilities requires, for example, some of the best military personnel to become trainers and advisors and embedded with foreign security forces so that they can improve their capacities and their capabilities. And as was indicated, we have a number of those folks here today who are currently training at Fort Riley as part of military transition teams. These teams will be undertaking a critical task when they deploy to train and stand up and mentor Afghan, Iraqi security forces, and those of other nations. There's perhaps, as we move into this new period, no more important mission. So folks, I thank you for all you've done and for all you are doing and all you will do. Thank you very much. In the past, U.S. efforts to train foreign security forces have been burdened by outdated restrictions. In Afghanistan, for example, building up the Afghan army was harmfully delayed because there was no such category in the U.S. federal budget at the time, and we lacked the authorities and the resources to do so for a period. Other painful delays in training the Afghan and Iraqi police forces were the result of the fact that it was the responsibility of others and not the Department of Defense, and we were prohibited from participating in training police in the early period. Further, the realities on the ground in the rest of the world do not correspond to the U.S. yearly budget process. When you think about it, we live in a fast-moving world, and it takes, in the Department of Defense, a year to develop a budget. It takes a year for the Congress to pass it, and then it takes a year to implement that budget. That's a 3-year cycle that results in a situation where during execution, you're basically dealing with stale facts, stale assumptions that were fashioned 2.5, 3 years before. And we don't have yet the speed and agility that we need. The department is currently drawing up proposals to reform existing regulations and authorities. Some of these regulations and rules and laws date back to the 1960s and unfortunately hamper effective U.S. action. Third, another area that government needs to be strengthened is in communications. Today's global 24-hour media presents new challenges for a government that operates on a very different schedule. Al-Qaeda's second-in-command, al-Zawahiri, has said that, quote, more than half of this battle is taking place in the battlefield of the media. This is the number 2 Al-Qaeda leader explaining to his people that it's not so much only on the battlefield today, it's in the media. The enemy we face has skillfully adapted to fighting wars in today's media age, but for the most part, our country and our government have not yet completed the adjustments that will be necessary. The enemy is fast, with headline-grabbing attacks by doctoring photographs, lying to the media, being trained to allege torture in their training manuals. The enemy successfully manipulates the free world's press, a press that they would never allow to be free, and they do so purposefully to intimidate and break the will of free people. We need to understand the ruthlessness, the skillfulness of this enemy. In 1961, Dwight Eisenhower spoke to the nation for the last time as president. He warned of a long struggle ahead. He said, and I quote, "We face a hostile ideology, global in scope, ruthless in purpose, and insidious in method. To meet it successfully, we must carry forward steadily, surely, and without complaint the burdens of a prolonged and complex struggle, with liberty the stake. As we look back on those crucial years during the Cold War, so too our grandchildren will one day look back on this time as a defining moment in American history. History will judge whether this generation did all we could to defeat a vicious, extremist enemy that threatens our security, our freedom, and our very way of life. Or if we left it to the next generation to try to fight an enemy then strengthened by our weakness and emboldened by a lack of resolve. Over my lifetime, I've had the opportunity to live in times of great consequence, times of war, times of peace. And I've met countless Americans from every corner of our magnificent country. I've developed an abiding faith in the wisdom and good judgment of the American people. Over time, on big issues, the American people find their way to right decisions. I've seen us triumph over dictators and tyrannies in many forms. And I believe that if we persevere today, and I'm convinced we will, and make the right choices, and develop a clear understanding of this new war we face, the first war of the 21st century, we can overcome the increasingly lethal threats that challenge our country. Despite all the enemy tries to do to make the world think otherwise, America is not what's wrong with the world. America is a force for good. We are on the right side of history. The great sweep of human history is for freedom. And let there be no doubt, we are on freedom's side. Thank you very much.
Take some questions?
Thank you very much. I'm told there's some microphones around, and I'd be happy to respond to some questions. I'll answer those I know the answer to, and the difficult ones I'll heave to Dick Myers. Where are the microphones located? Oh, there, they've got numbers. Here's one. There's one up there. There's one up there. There's one up there. If someone would like to pose a question, why don't you go and line up near them, and we can then start.
Okay, we have a question up here.
First of all, I want to thank you for your many years of service to our country. My concern with our global war on terror is that there are so few people fighting it. Besides the military and their families, they seem to be the only ones making.
I'm wondering if you could talk a little slower.
Okay.
I'm having trouble following in the echo.
Okay. My concern about the global war on terror is that there are so few people fighting it. Besides the military and their families, nobody else seems invested in the war. In World War II, the whole country was making sacrifices, trying to conserve and rationing and all of those things where everybody was involved in winning. Nowadays, it seems like the average American gets up, goes to work, comes home, watches American Idol, and goes to bed, never contributing to the war effort. And not only are they not contributing, but the average person isn't even inconvenienced by the war. My question is, what can be done to get more of the American people invested in winning this war?
That is a critical question, and it's something that troubles me and that I worry about, just as you obviously worry about it. I grew up in World War II and had a victory garden and used to buy the war bonds, $18.75, and if you held them long enough, it was $25. We, as you say, collected scrap and old rubber to be made into retread tires. The That was a period where the entire nation was mobilized as it had to be to deal with that. And it was for a relatively short period of time. And we prevailed. The Cold War, unlike World War II, the country did not mobilize. But we demonstrated over 50 years a perseverance to deal, as President Eisenhower said, with a global struggle. We did it through successive administrations of both political parties, not just in our country, but in the democratic capitals of Western Europe. It was a very different experience. What we're dealing with today is much more like the Cold War in that sense, that it's long, it's not a brief, high-intensity, conventional conflict where the great armies, navies, and air forces compete and it's over and you sign a treaty on the USS Missouri and end it. And what we have to do is recognize that. And I guess my uncle used to say that persuasion is a two-edged sword. Reason and emotion, plunge it deep. We have to use our reason, as we did during the Cold War, to, as a nation, be persuasive to our fellow citizens, to help them understand what's at stake. Every year that goes by, there is a greater and greater likelihood that weapons of mass destruction are going to end up in more and more hands. You see what Iran's doing, you see what North Korea's doing, you see what Iran did by way of providing weapons to the Hezbollah, to a non-state entity, and you look down the road and other countries are going to say, well, if Iran and North Korea are developing nuclear weapons, maybe we need to do that. And then you see these weapons in the hands of non-state entities that don't have real estate to defend, don't have an industrial base to defend, don't have a leadership class to defend, no address where you can go after them. It's a network. That's the world we're moving into. And we simply have to be smart enough, wise enough, to marry reason and emotion to see that we do the right things in this country. We did it during the Cold War. I don't have any doubt at all, but that we're going to be capable of doing it during this long struggle that we face against violent extremists.
Mr. Secretary, let's go up here to
Good.
three.
I'll give shorter answers. Maybe you got a lot of people lined up there.
Secretary Rumsfeld, the Military Commissions Act gives you the permission to be able to designate any American
I'm sorry
citizen.
again. There's a big echo, and I'm having a little trouble following the words. Just go a little slower, and I'll be able to hear you.
Sure. The Military Commissions Act gives you the
The
ability
military
to
what?
Military Commissions Act
Commissions. Oh, yes. Good, I hear you.
gives you the ability to designate any American an enemy combatant. Do you think that it's an inherent danger for individual Americans to be able to be subject to the whim of men just if they don't agree with their political position or whatnot?
Of course not. And the legislation that was passed by the Congress and signed by the President doesn't provide that. And there are all kinds of safeguards and checks and appeal processes in the Military Commissions Act.
We've got one right here.
Yes.
Secretary Rumsfeld, thank you so much for coming today. I'm the daughter of a veteran, I'm the wife of a veteran, I am the mother of a veteran, and I'm the proud mother of an active duty Marine right now. And we have two things we'd like to know from you.
Thank you.
My children would like to know what bird you flew when you were a Navy pilot.
Which what?
What bird you flew.
Uh-huh. The
And
last
we
one I flew was an S2F. It was there are none of them around. They're all in museums. It's a little embarrassing.
Thank you. We would also like to know your advice for somebody like my daughter who's going to graduate in 2 years, advice that you would give a young person.
Advice for a
very
young
much.
person. Study history.
Hey, there you go. There you go.
We need context. We've staked everything in this country, if you think about the gamble, we stake everything on the people, that they can, given sufficient information, will make the right decisions. They need context. We need context. History provides that context. And if there's one piece of advice I could give, it would be to focus on that and think about it and understand it. It will improve the ability of all of us to function as citizens in this great republic.
Let's go to, I think, up there for.
Yes, sir. Cadet Rep. Botanides, Air Force Detachment 270, Kansas State. With all the tough jobs that you have faced and criticism and stress and et cetera, how do you find the motivation to continue to push on?
My goodness. Those personal questions are hard. I guess the answer is that I feel so fortunate to have been able to participate and serve at important times in our country's history, and to do it with people like that.
Up here at 3 again.
How about you? Have you seen Brokeback Mountain? A little inside joke. My real question is this. If you were going to give yourself a letter grade for your performance as Secretary of Defense, what grade would that be?
Oh, I'd let history worry about that.
Okay.
Hello, Mr. Rumsfeld. Since this is a Landon lecture on public issues, I wanted to ask a question about a very pertinent public issue, and that is, Mr. Secretary, journalists across the nation, both conservative, liberal, moderate, politicians, former high echelon military commanders.
I'm sorry, you're going to have to speak a little slower.
Sorry.
For me to follow it.
Journalists across the nation, both conservative and liberal and moderate, politicians, former high echelon military commanders, and many other Americans say and believe that our policy in Iraq is quite simply broke. It's not working, it's not doing its job. What do you think that the next Secretary of Defense, who's been named as Mr. Gates, can do to fix that, to make our efforts in Iraq truly successful, truly a nation-building operation that creates a free, democratic, and peaceful Iraq?
Well, certainly that's the hope and the prayer of everyone involved, the troops and the leadership of our country. I certainly can't speak for the new incoming Secretary of Defense. I will say this. It is very clear that the major combat operations were an enormous success. It is clear that in phase 2 of this, it has not been going well enough or fast enough. On the other hand, there have been very impressive things that have been accomplished. The country has drafted a constitution. It's ratified a constitution. They have held an election and elected freely a government. 12 million Iraqis went out to vote. That is impressive. They have a stake in the success of that situation. The schools are open, the hospitals are open. They have a stock market. They have a free press. Now, you put all that on a scale against the fact that there's violence and sectarian violence, and there is, and that people are being killed, and Muslims are being killed by violent extremist Muslims. And it's important to know that that's what's happening over there. The commanders, General Casey and General Abizaid, have shifted their activities and their efforts over the past period as the circumstance on the ground has shifted and changed, and it has. The enemy has a brain, and they do things. They watch what happens and they make adjustments. And it is a much more complex situation, and quite honestly, our country does not have experience attempting to impose control and our will over vicious, violent extremists that don't have armies, don't have navies, don't have air forces, and operate in the shadows. It is a totally different circumstance. And I think that just as the Cold War required some patience and some perseverance and some resolve and some context, so too this effort will. And I don't have any doubt but that the President, working with the commanders and the new Secretary, will continue to make adjustments, and that if we have the perseverance and the resolve, we will end up seeing the Iraqi people ultimately take control of their country, govern their country, provide security for their country, and certainly that's our hope and our prayer.
How about one here?
Mm-hmm. Good morning, Secretary Rumsfeld. Thank you for coming here to speaking to us, and thank you, President Rumsfeld and Dr. Reagan, for bringing him here. My name is Wei Wu. I'm a Chinese language instructor here on campus. We just started a Chinese language program last year, and so some of my students are here with me today to listen to your speech. I have two questions, and I believe my students are also very interested in hearing your answer. First one is we would like to hear your opinion about China and U.S.-China relations. As the fall of Soviet Union, China seems to become more obvious in this so-called communist world or camp, or maybe former communist country, because China does go through a lot of changes. As you travel to China, you may see it. So we'd like to hear your opinion about China and U.S.-China relationship. Second question is we'd like to hear about your opinion about the importance of learning Chinese language.
About the what?
Importance of learning Chinese language from strategic point of view in the light of 21st century.
Well, I was going to say, I think your students chose very well to learn to study Chinese. I think it's a good thing and a wise thing, and our country needs to improve our language capabilities. The Department of Defense has been working very hard to see that more languages taught to the people there in the department, and also that a broader range of languages are taught. With respect to China, the Chinese people have made a very good decision to move towards a more open economic system and to engage the world. And they're doing it quite successfully. They have a very good rate of economic growth. They are increasingly, I think, recognizing that they are stakeholders in the success of the global economic system. They have a lot that depends on that. They also have some problems. They have some very serious environmental problems. They have some demographic problems. They have some problems with respect to riots and demonstrations, tens of thousands of them a year. Now, they have a big country. So they are managing their affairs in a way that is, I think, designed to create an environment that's hospitable to enterprise and to interaction with the rest of the world. They don't want to lose the Olympics, for example. They want to see that they do things in their country that makes people feel comfortable investing and trading and working with their country. I think those are good things. I think, on the other hand, that they face a bit of a dilemma. And the dilemma is they still have an unfree political system and an increasingly free economic system. Now, you can go down that road only so far. And at some point, if you want to have a highly successful free economic system, it's going to affect your political system in some way. In this sense, you're going to have an awful lot of people from other countries who are milling around in your country with computers and with cell phones, doing a lot of things that make it more difficult for you to manage your political system to the extent you want to have a controlled political system. So I don't know how those tensions will be resolved. Needless to say, like every person in the free world, we hope that they'll be resolved in favor of free systems. And I think that that is at least a reasonable prospect for China. They're not there yet. There's lots of things people can say to criticize them, but they're on a path that suggests they want to sustain that growth. And to do that, I think they're going to have to behave in a way that is entering the global economic system in a constructive way. Do you teach something like that, or are you?
I teach Chinese culture and the development of China, but also U.S.-China relations. Would you like to talk about that?
Oh, I think it started out pretty bumpy. They crashed into our EP-3 aircraft and then held our people hostage for days, many days. And it was a most unfortunate thing. This was in 2001. They behaved very badly. And I think they behaved badly because they were in a leadership struggle. And there was tension between the People's Liberation Army, the PLA, and the political leadership. And Jiang Zemin, as I recall, was in South America at the time. And it was a bad scene. They handled it very badly. Since that time, it's been on a clear uptick. We've improved military-to-military relations. We have greater economic interaction with them. And the political interaction has been generally more positive. So I think it's been on an improving path. Thank you.
I think we have time for 2 more questions, one here, and then we'll go up to 3.
Good.
2?
Hello, Mr. Rumsfeld. I'm Christian Schultz, and I'm studying geography right now in hopes of translating maps for Japan and Korea and possibly teaching there and to mission there too. Now, Mr. Rumsfeld, do you suppose that right before the invasion of Iraq, Saddam may have moved his WMDs out of the country and into the hands of countries and or organizations friendly and sympathetic to his former regime?
There are 2 things that are out there that I cannot speak to with a high degree of certainty. There are reports from people, Iraqis, that happened, that things were moved out of Iraq just prior to the military action. I can't prove that it happened. I can't prove that it did not happen. I guess that someday we'll know. We also know that the Iraqis buried a lot of things. They buried complete jet aircraft. Now, I can't quite imagine that when you think of what they cost and how easily they're damaged. To bury them in the ground takes a certain mentality. What else they may have buried, I don't know. The Delfer report, he was the man who had the responsibility over there, came back and he wrote a report and said that the weapons of mass destruction efforts of Iraq were basically on hold. That is to say, they had a capability to rapidly upgrade their chemical and biological weapons. And I think that's close to what he said. And they did not have a nuclear program underway, but they had kept together their nuclear cadre, the people who had previously been involved with it. And I've not seen anything since the Delfer report that contradicts that. So we will know more at some point. And there are literally millions of pages of Iraqi documents that are now being released into the internet, and it's going to take a long time to translate them and figure it all out. And you probably read about one of the problems recently where some information was put on the internet that explains how to make some weapons, which was criticized. My personal view is that it's a good idea to get that information out to the extent we can, and to do it sooner rather than later.
Just one more up here.
This is the last question. Make it a pip.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah. In your speech, you mentioned 9/11, and it has been widely reported that 15 of the 19 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia, and it is reported that, or it's believed that some of the insurgents fighting in Iraq today comes from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia was not attacked. Why? And
So excuse me, you said Saudi Arabia was attacked?
was not attacked by you and your government.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah. And do you think that this war on terror could be successful without Saudi Arabia towing the line? Thank you.
Thank you. Violent extremists do not all come from one country. They come from a lot of countries, many, many countries. If one looks at the mixture in the detainees that have been arrested in Iraq and Afghanistan and London and Madrid and various parts around the world, Saudi Arabia, there are 10, 15, 20 countries that are represented with people, their citizens, involved in these terrorist networks. It would be, of course, mindless to run around declaring war against all the countries who happen to have citizens who are violent extremists. Saudi Arabia, ever since they were attacked several years ago by violent extremists, has been out doing a great many things to go after the extremists in their country, to put them in jail, to arrest them, and to attempt to deal with the seedbed of that problem. They've been attempting to deal with those that teach people violence and extremism. So it is a complicated thing. We have allies, good friends and allies that have violent extremists that come out of their country, and they don't like it, and we don't like it. But the task, as I mentioned in my remarks, is for us to help them develop their capacity so that their law enforcement officers and their military develops a better capability to go after the extremists that exist in their country. And the truth is, we can't, it's a very difficult thing. We're trying to fight a war, and how do you do that when you're not at war with the countries where the problems are? You can't just pretend you're at war with them. You're not. They're friends and allies, and they're trying to do it. The only thing you can do is to help them develop their capability so that they can do a better job going after those extremists before they can attack them or other free people. The people that are also at risk are governments like the Saudi government and like the moderate governments in that region. Those are the principal targets of al-Qaeda. That is their first goal, is to destabilize all of those countries. I'm getting the hook. I've enjoyed being here, and I thank you very much.
Thank you. It's excellent.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, folks. I really appreciate that very warm welcome that you've given me.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. Thank you so much for answering as many questions as you did. I want to thank you and Joyce. We'll be eternally grateful that you came to K-State to deliver a great Landon lecture. Let's give them another big hand. And there we go. Now, how about this, huh? Thank you. Thank you, sir.